A very warm welcome to the RSA Professional Development Webinar Series today. My name is Sabine Dörry and I will chair the session. But before moving to the webinar, please let me give you some more general information about the RSA and also provide you with some housekeeping rules. So this webinar is organized by the Regional Studies Association, and the RSA is the global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development, and policy. The RSA supports its members with latest research, funding schemes, networking and publishing opportunities, and spaces to grow research and careers. As a response to the current global crisis, the RSA board put in place a number of initiatives to support its members and the wider communities, such as the Professional Development Seminar Webinar Series, as this one here today, and the Regions, Cities, Industry Webinar Series, but also a small grant scheme for which new deadlines will be announced very soon. So I invite you also to consult the RSA website to get more details on these and other initiatives as well. The RSA has also developed a new app called RSA Hub, which will enable you to network and attend virtual events throughout the year. So let me guide you through some housekeeping rules for this webinar today. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available for RSA members on the RSA Lounge. Please, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box below at the bottom of your screen. And today we will probably start with, a 15 to 20 minutes presentation in order to introduce you to the topic before we enter a broader discussion and answer as many of your questions as possible and time permits. Well, today's career development seminar is about how to write a winning academic CV, because getting started on your first academic CV can seem like a daunting task, and especially as a PhD student or early career researcher. But fear not, this webinar will cover important topics in order to prepare you for setting up and maintaining a winning academic CV when applying for your first or the next academic job. And it is my big pleasure to introduce our today's speaker to you. Henrik Halkier is a professor of tourism and regional development and dean of the Faculty of Humanities at Aalborg University in Denmark. He has published on regional development policy, tourist destination development, place branding, and food tourism. Henrik has also taught and supervised in international and cross-cultural studies, and has been engaged in triple helix collaboration in regional and tourism development on an ongoing basis. In between, Henrik has contributed to leadership at Aalborg University and beyond. And his blog on life in Denmark under Corona seems to be written by his cat and appears on the Nordic Horizons Facebook group. Well, Henrik, you and of course your cat made us very curious now, and without further ado, I will hand over the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sabine. I'm afraid my cat couldn't be with me today because I'm at work rather than at home. But there you are. Thank you very much to the Regional Studies Association for inviting me to this to give this talk. I realize the format of this, as Sabine explained, is that I give a presentation and then we have questions and answers afterwards. But before I start, I'd actually quite like to ask you a question. And so we prepared a little poll. Could we have the poll on the screen, please? Excellent. So the question I'd like you to answer is, have you used a standardized CV for an application in the last 12 months? So it's an easy question. It's either yes or no, and then you press submit at the bottom, and then we'll see how things look from across the world from your perspective. In what I'll do in the presentation while we are waiting for the polls to come in is basically to I have 4 slides I want to share with you. Each of them contain 3 points, and following that there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully I can provide some answers, and everything will be chaired by Sabine, who keeps track of questions and track of the time as well. So in a sense, what you get today is, I guess, tips and tricks from someone who reads, in my work as a dean, lots of CVs, and I've also over the years, I guess, written quite a few myself. So it's a sort of practical perspective on CV. I've never written a book on writing the perfect CV. It's a practitioner's view, if you like, on CV making. I think we could stop the poll now and see where we stand in terms of result. And the answers to the question, have you used a standardized CV? It's nearly 50-50. 44% says yes, 56% says no. Thank you very much. I think this is an excellent starting point, because some of you have experience with standardized CVs, others have adopted other approaches. The first point I would like to emphasize is this, namely that you write a CV. It's not something that you have, it's something that you produce time and time again. And I think that is the key point about writing a winning academic CV, is the fact that it's not a static thing. It's something that you have to work hard for, to produce time and time again. Now, so why is the CV so important from a career perspective? The answer to this is, I think, a very simple one, namely that your CV is a stepping stone. It's something that'll help you to get from where you are on the one hand, and to where you want to go. So in order to write a CV, what you really need to do is to be clear about where are you just now in terms of competences and experiences on the one hand. This is the background, where are you? And then secondly, there's the question of where do you want to go? Now that where, of course, is defined by the fact that often it's a specific position you're trying to apply for. So you need to do research into what this kind of place is like, what kind of job on the one hand, what kind of institution is it on the other hand. And then essentially the art of writing a winning academic CV is about minding the gap between where you are on the one hand and then where you want to go on the other. So your CV, in a sense, is a communication vehicle. You need to spend time checking out who it is you're talking to, and bear in mind that your CV is your 2 minutes sale pitch. I think I've actually, perhaps 2 minutes is being generous if you think of deans and heads of department, and they get 80 applicants or more for a position. How long will they spend on each CV? Because that's where you start when you are assessing applicants. You've got very short window of time to convince people that you're a person that they need to take a closer look at. Could we have the next slide, please? So basically, an important piece of advice, I think, is this, namely that for each application you have to write, you need to write a new CV. You need to have a CV that's specific to the application. So you need to write a new CV for every application you write. So what you do, of course, is unsurprisingly, you try to highlight in your CV your specific core strengths. On the one hand, what have you done in terms of typically in terms of research, but also I think importantly, what are you doing at the moment? In other words, it's not just about looking back, it's also about telling people where you are at this particular time, what's on your mind, what's on your desk, what's on your screen. So specific core strengths, of course, is a very important part of your CV. But I think also to write a winning CV, I think you also need to think from the perspective of the recipient of the CV to try to broaden their horizon. What else do you bring in your baggage? What else do you bring to the table in terms of your experience with and interest with regard to teaching, supervision? Have you trained in particular areas professionally? Have you been involved in projects? Have you perhaps helped to manage a project? Have you been involved in fundraising? Have you been involved in collaboration with other colleagues in the university, with external partners, perhaps even international partners? And also try to convey things in your CV that somehow suggest that you'll be part of a team, that you'll play for the team. You're not just a great researcher and have interesting interests outside academia, but you're also something that will want to go that extra mile for the organization. So in other words, the core of your strengths is important, but all the add-ons are also important, because there are a lot of people out there who have worked hard, who have published a lot, etc. But what's the extra you bring to this particular particular position? Try to sell that as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So there is the issue of what makes your CV a winning academic CV, and I think the main point about this is that you need to grab attention in a professional manner. You can do lots of things with fancy graphics and pictures and etc. But in a sense, while this might catch the eye in the first second or 2 seconds, what you really need also to do is to make sure that you'll grab the reader's attention in a professional manner. And in that respect, I think an important feature of your CV should be what I call your professional profile. In other words, a very, very short statement, perhaps no more than 100 or 150 words, about how you will add value to the position you are applying for. So in other words, this is the summary. Think of this as the abstract is really important when you submit an article, or indeed when you read an article. This is where you decide whether you want to read the rest or just move on to the next one. CVs functions in exactly the same way, and therefore having this profiling thing at the very top, I think, is really, really helpful, because that's where you start as a reader. And what you do here basically is the spin doctor's job. What you do is that you spin your CV on the basis of the job advertisement. So you try to make that stepping stone, your CV, that stepping stone between the job on the one hand and where you are and what you have experienced on the other, and put it in a nutshell. What's the added value of your contribution? So this is an important and also in a sense, a difficult thing to do, because you may think that you have lots of things to offer, and I've just advised you to include lots of different aspects that, in a sense, you will also bring to the table. But what are the core things that you will add value? The one that is really, really important. I think that's a good way to start good way to start a CV. Don't have them put it all together. The CVs have all sorts of different lengths. From some people manage to squeeze it all in one page. Others have expansive CVs of 2, 3, 4 pages. But no matter whether it's just a page or it's 2 pages or even more, if you don't have this professional profile at the start, you leave it to the reader to do the spinning. Now you may say, "Oh yes, but I'm in the application. There's the actual application itself, which is typically a longer document." But you know what? In most cases, those who are assessing applications start with the CV and then move on to the to the actual application if their attention is grabbed by the CV. So therefore, having this little abstract, which is in a sense an abstract of your of the full application, I think is a really useful exercise. And it also helps you in another way, namely that this is in a sense the written version of what you could call the elevator pitch. When someone asks you, what are you working on? You've got like 20 seconds to grab their attention, and this is what you need to do as well. Apart from this, of course, there's a lot of standard things that go into the CV, where you need to think about, well, what's work on the layout to make it look nice. You may consider bringing in a picture of yourself. You may want to, if people start grabbing your if you've grabbed people's attention, maybe they want to know more, perhaps. And occasionally, one of the ways that evil managers like myself try to check out the applicants is you're interested in, what are they trying to tell you in the CV and in the application. But if you go to their LinkedIn profile, you get an impression of what kind of other things might they be interested in, what kind of communication, what kind of things do they write about in a professional capacity. So if you have a LinkedIn profile, and if you have an updated LinkedIn profile, that's a very useful thing to include. I think proofreading is also important. It's like, well, does it matter if you misspell a word? No, not really. But it's the sort of underlying communication of, well, maybe this was done in too much haste. Maybe there's a lack of attention to detail here. So just for the sake of it, if you end up with a reader that's a stickler for detail, do have your stuff proofread, and by someone else than yourself, obviously, because you're the last. Sometimes you're the last person to actually see the errors that you have made. And for some reason, and maybe that's just because I'm paranoid, I think actually handing in your CV as a PDF file, which can't be manipulated, it is a good sign. It's sort of, to my mind, it signals a serious approach to things. Maybe you always do PDF, so it's not a problem. It's just, I don't know. It just shows you that this is the finished article. It's not just a word in progress. And if we could have the final slide. I think if this is a process, and I've stressed the fact that you need to write a new CV for every application, and I think that takes me to my last point, namely that in order to be able to do this, you need to prepare. And I think there are two issues of preparation that are important. The first one is what I've termed short-term coordination. Make sure that your CV and your application is synchronized. It's like two on occasion, and it's actually more common than you might think. Some information is given in the application that is different to the information that's in the CV. And again, that just, conveys an impression of sloppiness. Plus, of course, as a reader, you don't really know which one is the right one then. And I would also say that if you then are under a great time pressure, and sometimes everyone is under great time pressure when you have to make applications, the fact that the later you leave the writing of the CV in the application process, the greater the risk is that you fall for the temptation of putting in a standard as a standard CV. And that is just, a standard CV gives you a general impression of people, but it's more difficult to use a standard CV as a stepping stone from where you are, which doesn't change much, but where you want to go might change depending on what kind of position you're applying for. So I think it's very important to have this have this in mind, that be aware of too much standardization here. In order to be able to manage this in practice, I think it's important to be prepared to write to write a CV for the specific position you're applying for. And part of this is long-term preparation. In some cases, if you already have a job at a university, you may have access to an institutional repository where your activities are linked, your publications, your teaching activities, your collaborations, whatever prizes and other stuff you have been engaged in. So that's one way of keeping track of things. Another thing which I think is getting increasingly useful as well, of course, is to update your public face, which often nowadays is a profile on LinkedIn. So that's worth spending time on as well. And then, especially if you are thinking that you will be moving between institutions as your career develops, I'm thinking it's actually quite, as a backup, a good idea to produce what I call a maximum CV. You need to produce it. It's like a collection of all your publications, all your presentations at conferences, all your teaching, etc., which you'll end up, I guess, never ever using, because that's just a list of things. It's not directed towards a particular position. So to sum up, I think my advice is keep on writing your CV. Make sure that you target it specifically to the position you're applying for, and try to grab attention. You've got a very short window of opportunity to make people believe that you're a really interesting person in relation to this particular position. And then, in order to do this, make it easier for yourself by being prepared. That was what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrik, for a very comprehensive overview. And questions have already started pouring in. And I think also, with view of the time, let me just jump to the first questions here. And a couple of people actually asked the same one. What is the appropriate or a usual length, or the conventional length of a CV, for instance, for a permanent academic position of, say, an assistant professorship at a European university? And perhaps coupled with the question, what's the font size? How small can it be, or how big should it be? And yeah, let's leave it for that. Yeah, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. These are good questions. I think in terms of links, occasionally you'll come across situations where it's specified in advance that a particular links is required, and then obviously the question is answered because you got to stick to the limit. If it's a freestyle CV, I reckon that if it runs beyond 2 pages, it's starting to get long, and that means that bits of it needs to be put elsewhere. For instance, you have a relatively short CV, but if you think it's useful to have a full list of your publications, then add that on as a separate item, I would say. In terms of font, you just take a good hard look at myself at this point in time. A lot of the people who be reading your CVs are people who are relatively old characters, right? So their eyesight is not what it used to be, which means that do not try to cram things in by using like 10, size 10, or even I think 12 is a nice size. 11 works for most people. If you go down to 10 or below, it just gets sort of blurry. And I think if you vary font sizes too much in the CV, it just ends up becoming distracting to some way. So if you want the minimum one I'd go for would be 11, but yes.
Sure, thank you. I'm trying to bringing a couple of questions together. So perhaps what is the format of a CV in, for instance, the order in which the information is presented? If we do not use a standardized CV in an application, and related to that is also how do you organize the CV when you do not have a template? Perhaps that is something you can elaborate.
I think in terms of the sequence of things, I think that reflects a lot on what kind of position you're applying for, and secondly, what your experience is. The more experience you've got, the more in job wise, the more your current and previous positions need to go up front, because that's what people are interested in. The less you have, the more your actual education comes into play, because that's your main asset, that you had this great degree from a really good university, and the title of your thesis fits exactly what they're looking for in this particular job advertisement. So the sequence in that sense is flexible. In terms of the format, I'm thinking it a lot of it reflects also on what kind of position it is. It depends on, in other words, is this heavily research oriented position? Is it heavily teaching oriented? So the sequence changes according to put the most important things up first, because that's what people will be looking for, I guess.
Thank you. So we are running already a little late. Please, I would just flag that we may run maximum 10 minutes over time. So let me just, again, some questions. We have a very international audience here, and people are asking, are there any national differences between CV formats, or will the EU format always work everywhere? And what is your opinion on that? Perhaps we can also take the other question. How do you think, or on the other side, who receive the CVs, if there are different nationalities, how do they perceive CVs from scholars with a different national backgrounds? Perhaps from your experience, you can share some thoughts with us.
Yes, I'm thinking in terms of national formats, the best way to go about this is basically to nowadays lots of university employees have their CVs in accessible formats, either on the university websites or otherwise it's possible to Google to check out some of these guys and how they do. I think to my mind is a great source of inspiration, and that would of course mean that you also get acquainted with the peculiarities of the British and the Germans and the Hungarians and so on and so forth. Now it's tempting to say that the sort of standardized EU format is useful. I've always had two things against the EU format, so I'll share them with you. And the first one is it takes up a lot of space. It really, the way it's organized means that a normal CV will grow with like 30% or something, so you can include less. Now that makes it more spacious. Some guys will like that, but I'm also thinking that the EU format seems to be originally developed for the purpose of getting all the information you need in a standardized format in connection with grant applications. So it's more about getting money for grants. So therefore the grant bit is very important there. So my thoughts are that it can be used, but I'm not. It's not necessarily an advantage. I think when you read CVs that come from international applicants, it's always it has, you know, there's a special, if they're slightly different, it either grabs your attention or sometimes you scratch your head. But under all circumstances, you start looking for what's the core information. We know what we are looking for in this position. Make sure it's up front. How specifically you organize it or illustrate it or whatever, that's not a major concern.
Thank you. I think in your presentation, you also mentioned to communicate your skills very, very well. And one of the questions here we have from a PhD student who's asking, I have no publications, but a lot of gray literature, and I have taught a lot. So a lot of teaching here. Is there a way to present this kind of my skills or my experiences in a better way for people at the beginning of their careers? So if you don't have this kind of fully fledged skill set
Yes.
yet.
I'm thinking that this is where you really need the profiling device at the top, where you in a nutshell say, this is how I add value. Look at me, I've got lots of experience in producing a lot of texts under time pressure and collaboration with others. If it's reports or gray literature, I've got a lot of experience with working with external project partners who have paid for these activities. So in that sense, you develop a specific set of skills, which are not the same skills, of course, as writing academic articles, but also in many universities would be seen as important skills, because of course a lot of positions have increasingly a dimension of having to work with external partners in relation to research projects. So that kind of experience needs to be highlighted in the profiling, and then of course listed further down.
Perhaps again a bunch of questions. What are the most common or recommended sections to include in an academic CV? I mean, you partly already answered that, but also, I mean, going through, if you advertise a post, going through 70 and more applications, what bothers you most, or what do you appreciate most when reading or scanning the CVs?
You need to know what people have done research-wise. You need to know what they have done teaching. I'm assuming now this is an assistant professor, for instance, or a junior lecturer. You need to know what they've written. You need to know which research projects they have been associated with. You need to know their teaching experience. You need to know whether they have whether they have been involved in fundraising efforts themselves. You need to know what other kind of involvement in broader university business they might have had. You need to you need to think about uh, being members of committees or part of task force or whatever. And then you also need to know something about the experience with collaborating with other partners, either locally stakeholders around their university or international networks, etc. I'm less curious about what you do in your spare time, I must say. It can be funny. It can once you get towards that, it's because we want to invite you for an interview. So I want to know what kind of talking points there are. So I don't mind at all it being included, but I think that's perhaps of minor importance in average.
Thank you, Henrik. With again, perhaps we're just asking the last round of with 2 questions, or rounding up with 2 questions. So there's a very long question, and we sort of like answered a couple of them, but perhaps you could share your thoughts on how do I know what is expected in the CV or from my application, because this person has written a lot of CVs for very different applications, for different posts, both in academia and outside academia. And if she's actually putting all the information in one CV, that could be 30 to 100 pages long. So how does she know what is the maximum length? Well, what you would recommend, I think we touched upon that question already, but how does she know what is expected, and how does the selection process is carried out? Perhaps here again, just emphasizing a couple of things. And you also mentioned during your application, what you said something like, this participant is asking, what do you exactly mean by the application? Is it the cover and motivation letter, or is it something else? I think on top of the CV, I assume.
Let me answer the last bit first. It was exactly the cover and motivation letter, and I guess I reveal my Scandinavian background by using the word application, because this is the main document in the Scandinavian tradition, and it also highlights something else which I think is important in the question, namely that it's very, very context specific, and getting. I think the length of the CV often, the appropriate CV often depends on what kind of position you're applying for. If it's a junior position, the expectation is that it's a relatively short one. The more senior it gets, if you get to a full professorship, you expect them to be longer. But actually, I think that often means that you end up breaking up the CV in a relatively short document, like 2 or 3 pages, and then you have additional enclosures where you give them everything on your publication, everything on your presentations, everything on so on so. But the national differences in terms of how you assess them are different. In some that I can think of 2 extremes, and now I use Britain and Sweden as an example.
Mm-hmm.
In Britain, my clear impression is that there's a small group of people, including often the head of department or the owner of the project that funds a particular position, that gets together, look at the CVs first and foremost, and find the most appropriate applicants for a particular position, and then you get interviews, etc. In other extreme cases, and Sweden and Norway is an example of this, you get a committee of academics, not the head of department, but a committee of academics sitting down, looking at not just the CV, but your actual application, and in a sense do a second kind of peer review, which then decides, are you appointable for this position or not? Are you qualified or not? And then at a second stage, the head of department,
Yeah.
etc., kicks in. So the tradition is really really different compared to I don't know enough about appointment procedures across Europe to say whether it's the continent versus Britain. Denmark falls somewhere in between, so we're not all like Swedes in Scandinavia, and this particular instance anyway.
It is just, so I would like to start wrapping up. However, I just one more question here. Could you give some examples of this, what you just suggested, that the use of CV to show where one would like to go in the future? How do you illustrate that in the CV? If you could like give us 1 or 2 sentences, then I'm wrapping up the session. And
yes, I'm thinking this is primarily the stuff that you put in at the very front as the profiling guy. I'm trying to so the example would be I'm trying hard to develop my competences in combining research and teaching in this particular area. So it's a sort of combination. It's not just I want to be a great researcher, but I want to combine these two things. This is my ambition. And the only reason I would write this in a profiling thing at the top would be that I know that this is a position where there's both teaching and there's research. And what I then add of value is I say my ambition is to bring these things together to make them even better.
Thank you so much, Henrik. We do have a couple of more questions, but I invite everybody perhaps to also send an email to Henrik as our expert. I assume this concludes our webinar for today. I would like to thank all the participants for their very enthusiastic engagement here in the discussion, and of course our fabulous speaker, Henrik Halkier. This was the last session of this or in this year, and the series will restart on Wednesday, the 20th of January, with Henry Young on understanding journal and researcher metrics. And please, again, for further information on this and other series, please consult the RSA website. I would like again to thank you all. Please do stay safe and goodbye.